Well,
That is
welcome everybody.
just
This is
gorgeous.
not just old time friends reunion. This is actually a one-to-one conversation with Jan Winhall, and I'm really pleased to welcome Jan, of course, and all of you. I know we have many of Jan's fans and followers and readers, and we have people who might have just heard of her, and said, what's this all about? So the purpose of this conversation is really to get to know Jan and her work and her new book. She'll be in Toronto presenting a workshop for us in May. And let me just start with how we're going to work this next hour. First, the first part of our session will be an interview and back and forth with Jan and I. And then 35, 40 minutes into it, we're going to open up for questions and answers. And we really appreciate your involvement. It really makes this whole thing so much better. We found that out during COVID, that people wanted to talk to each other. And that's why you're welcome to add your image on the screen and ask the question that way. Or you can put it in the chat line. Now, you also might see on the screen Emily Porter, Leading Edge Seminars, and she is our moderator and hostess with the mostest, who'll be there looking at the chat line. If you need to be in touch with her for any problem or whatever, feel free to use the chat line. And also, if you want to put the transcription on the screen and see the words as well as hear them, you're welcome to do this. And finally, we'll be sending everyone who signed up for this a copy of this video in the next few days. If there are parts of it you want to see again, um, or if you've come in late or something, it'll be there for you. So that's the introduction. So Jan, thank you very much for being here today. Um, I'm
It's
very
a
excited about your upcoming session. And I would just like to start off, for people who know you and people who don't, tell us about your whole journey into trauma and addiction work. I know you've come from various different backgrounds and trainings, and now you've come up with this Felt Sense model, but give people a sense of your journey professionally.
I started, and you and I are both from Toronto, and we live actually very close together. And I started here way back in the 1980s, early 80s, graduated from graduate school. And I ended up getting a job at a hospital that was in the outskirts of Toronto, in a really high needs area of the city. And my job there, in part, was to run a group for young women who were incest survivors. And that's really where I learned so much about the work and the world of trauma and addiction and self-harm. And everything I'm basically sharing in the Felt Sense Polyvagal model starts there, really. Because I realized in working with these young women who were mostly back then being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and still are, being treated in a really misogynistic and pathologizing way, and often still are. And I wanted to really meet their needs in a more respectful and authentic way. So I went hunting. And I think you and I shared that we both remember the No More Secrets conferences in Toronto. Amazing, amazing work. I mean, this was over, it must got to be almost 40 years ago. And Judy Herman, for example, came to that conference. And so we were all so excited as young feminist therapists, and we started reading her work. And I got exposed to Mary Armstrong, who's a focusing oriented therapist that worked very closely with Eugene Gendlin, who is the father of the term felt sense. And I just started training in somatic body work way back then. Um, and it really shaped the way that I've thought about and approached the whole area of trauma and addiction in a much more bottom up and top down, but very bottom up friendly way, really embracing our bodies, which we've forgotten about. And I think it's led to so many things that are problematic in the world today, particularly in the work that we do as trauma and addiction therapists. So that's how it
So
started.
that's how it started, and the influence of Gendlin.
Mhm.
And then you somehow got introduced to Steve Porges and polyvagal theory. Tell us about your
Yeah.
introduction and what first struck you, because I know when he came on the scene, it seemed like, where did this come from? We don't know what this is about. And what was your beginnings with him and his work?
I think it came through Dan Siegel's work with interpersonal neurobiology. And I went to hear Dan Siegel and started reading a lot about his work, which I love. And then in 2012, I went to a conference where Steve Porges was presenting. And the way that Steve talked about the paradigm shift, right, which is really the basis, the foundation of polyvagal theory and the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. It's this shift from understanding what we call pathologies, disorders, into understanding these ways that bodies respond, like self-harm and addiction, and dissociation, as adaptive responses in a maladaptive environment. So the opposite of the way that we're taught, that people aren't maladaptive, our behaviors are adaptive when we're responding to traumatic maladaptive environments. And so I just loved what Steve was talking about. And also in the feminist world in the early days, we always talked about safety. I mean, Judith Herman's first phase in her 3 phases of working with someone is establishing safety. And so this language was very familiar to me in terms of the utmost importance of safety. And I started reading more about, attempted that big scary blue book on polyvagal theory, which I have to say, frankly, I didn't get far in. I mean, Deb Dana's done a great job with translating those concepts. Um, but I can read it now. And I think one of the things I really want to be able to impart to people is that first, the wisdom of polyvagal theory. It took off with trauma therapists because we all could see dissociation in the body. We saw the way that the body collapses and shuts down. And so Steve was naming it. It's like, this is this place. And this is in response to a complete lack of perceived safety. So it really resonated, and I think that's why it's really taken off. And because that is our primary source of awareness is safety. And especially now, look at where we are. Yeah.
When you first started integrating the ideas from polyvagal theory, could you just give what was that transition like? And can you tell us about some of those early cases, not the whole cases, but where you started to see with clients that this was making sense for you?
Yeah. Well, I saw it before polyvagal theory in the sense that we talked about numbing and flooding. That was our kind of language for understanding trauma prior to polyvagal theory in the trauma, certainly in the feminist world. And so we knew about numbing and flooding in the body, and we could see this in our clients. We could see the way that body shapes are different when someone is flooding in a sympathetic response. There's constriction, right? And when they're numbing or shutting down, there's this collapse and moving in the absence of social engagement. And so it gave us a neurophysiological explanation, the language for understanding the physiology of what we were picking up on and understood psychologically. And so I think that having both of those ways of understanding trauma is very potent. It's very powerful when you understand the neurophysiology and that bodies are simply wired to survive at all costs. So dissociating is actually a gift when there isn't enough safety. And that's the paradigm shift. And
Yeah.
then you can share that with your clients, which is so enormously empowering for people. It brings what we call moments of liberation. It's the most de-shaming way I think we can offer to clients. This is just how bodies react through addictions that's how bodies react in order to survive.
I imagine they felt such relief because a lot of times therapy can feel very blaming, especially for people with addictions, that they're bad, they're doing bad things. Why don't they get their life together? What's wrong with them? And
Absolutely.
what you say to them must come as such a relief.
Mhm. It's a
Yeah.
it's the reason why doing this work, particularly around addiction, which is really hard work, is not only manageable, but that it's actually wonderful work because you can really give people this sense of, you're not weird, you're not sick, you're not bad, you're doing what your body was designed to do to keep you alive. And on that level, bodies don't think through the prefrontal cortex. They think about surviving. And then good people do bad things.
Yeah. So then so you decided to write a book on treating trauma and addiction with a felt self model. Uh, Tell us how that evolved, because obviously you wanted to change the way people think about addiction, both
Mhm.
therapists and their clients. So tell us about the evolution of that book, which is really the predecessor to the 20 Embodied Practices, your new book.
The first book, yeah.
Yeah.
But once I had kind of traveled through a number of different theoretical frameworks, like I think lots of us do, right? We're curious. We look over here and find this, and then we find another one that appeals. So we had the feminist trauma therapist kind of approach, and then the interpersonal neurobiology. Then I thought, well, how does if addiction isn't a brain disease, what is it? How do we explain it? And really became more aware of neuroplasticity and Mark Lewis's work, The Biology of Desire. So helping to understand how addictions through a learning model, but they really are feedback loops that occur in the brain. And the good news about that is that you can rewire those feedback loops in a way that feeds very nicely into polyvagal theory and neural exercises that we know we can do to rewire the brain. And so focusing then, of course, was another piece of that. And then I just started teaching U of T students in the MSW program. And when you start teaching, you have to think more about what you're doing, right? And how to teach what you're doing. What are the concepts? What are the frameworks? How does it fit theoretically? And so my brain is like, like salad, like picking up all these different paths and ways of thinking, but then they've got to be held together with something. And then I discovered that I really loved writing and loved teaching. So I started writing it down. Yeah. And then with 20 embodied practices, it was about, okay, how to then take this model and create embodied practices that help people to move through the process, the healing process.
So maybe we should shift to the 20 embodied practices, which you'll be talking about at our workshop in person. And the
Mhm.
book is coming out very soon. It's not quite out yet, is it?
March 18th.
March 18th. Okay.
And
So turn,
I just finished narrating it. So there will be an audio book that I've narrated, it was a lot of intense work doing that, but I'm really glad that I did it because I think having the audio book and the printed book will help a lot. Yeah.
why don't you take us through some, I know you have some slides. I don't know if this is a good time to just give people a sense of what this book is all about, because that will be more of a focus as we carry on this conversation and of your workshop. And let's start with that. What would you like to tell people about the book and show people?
Well, I'll show you. This is how we work. It's just a few slides about how we work in the body. And because I'm a very visual person, and I think, embodiment is very visual. We live more in the right hemisphere when we really connect with the body. And so we use a lot of graphic models. This is what we call the 7 Fs, and it's our model that really captures shape and color and design as a way of helping people to understand the autonomic nervous system and also focusing in the felt sense. And so we teach this in a very simple way. We talk about this ventral state in the body that we call flock. We just made it 7 Fs to make it simple to really remember and helping people to really get a sense of what these states feel like in the body. So we know this ventral place is really this place of coming together, connecting in social engagement, co-regulating with each other, like we're doing now, and creating community. And then when bodies feel some threat, they go up into the sympathetic response of flight, fight, and we feel that in the body in constriction. So if we just even take a moment now and feel, that sense of when you're in flight, fight, what happens in your body? And I think we feel, into a loud noise, and we constrict up and tighten up like that in flight or fight. Or sometimes we're shifting back and forth in both. And then over here is this dorsal collapse state that Steve Porges named for us, where we avoid and we shut down in order to be able to stay safe. And in that place, we don't seek out social connection. And this is so important for us to know with our clients, because this is the place where we have to kind of override what the body wants to do and tell ourselves through top down to get up and go for a walk, or to get up and phone a friend. So we do a lot of working with people around how to manage these states. Fun Fired Up is a blended state between the settling of flock and the kind of sympathetic energy with adrenaline. Over here is a blended state we call flowing, which is the blending of that lovely ventral energy with stillness. So the stillness immobilization part of the dorsal branch. And this is where focusing and lots of very soft and slow practices happen. And this is how we understand addiction up here as the fixate, freeze, and fawn state. And in addiction, we end up going through this trauma feedback loop from flight, fight, drink a bottle of wine, and shut down into fold. Or we can go the other way with self-harm and addiction. We're in a dorsal state. We cut the body, for example. Some people will report if they see blood, they shift back up into constriction and flight, fight. So this is how we understand addictions in the polyvagal world. And so you see, you can teach your clients actually how to trace what is happening in the nervous system, and have a sense of that trauma feedback loop in the top half of the model, where they're just not living in ventral grounded energy. There's no full felt sense of experience in the body in addiction, because it hurts. It's too painful to be present. So we seek to avoid that. And then Gendlin's beautiful work with felt sensing. This is an interoceptive process. So the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is based on neuroception, finding and working with the nervous system, and also interoception, and we use focusing, which is a natural process, the way that the body works, where when we feel enough of that sense of grounded ventral energy, the body starts to slow down, we start to relax and open, and we can feel the real fullness of life and of presence. And so Gendlin created these 6 steps in order to help people to find that felt sense, because it's hard for people to be able to do that, especially if they're in a trauma place. So we use these 2 processes when we teach, and we teach these to our clients, and we also move through them in our own experiencing, because it's through what's happening in me that I can start to really be present with you. And so we teach people that as you move through the steps and become more aware of what's happening in your body, the fullness of a felt sense starts to happen. So we're imagining there's these 2 embodied processes. So you see, you can take this model and bring anything you want into it. So you can bring in IFS, if you're working with DBR or DBT or CBT, any of those models, those frameworks are great if we bring embodiment in. And the way we do that here is through interoception and through neuroception. So teaching people, you've got this bi-directional feedback loop that's happening in the body, and we can actually work with it to help people to feel better in their lives. So we use body cards. This is a big part of the work that we do. And here's an example of a body card where a person is in a focusing session, moving through those steps with a partner. And they're moving from a dorsal heavy blue state. And then there's also in that fixate freeze some sympathetic constriction. So you see how bodies are complex, right? When you ask people to draw them, you begin to really understand how they work. And then as we move through this beautiful focusing process together, where your partner is following your journey and listening with compassion, bodies will naturally often shift into that flock ventral state. And this process happens all the time in life, and certainly we hope in therapy sessions where the person comes in, they're in this rigid or collapsed state. We are with them, we follow them somatically and with our presence, and they begin to open and release and blossom. And through felt focusing, we notice this felt shift that occurs. And really this model that I've created, the heart of it is this. It's understanding that felt shifts in the body, this physical release that happens in the yellow and the oranges up here, are actually shifts in autonomic state. And that's what I kind of put together as a focusing trainer for 30 years, and then understanding polyvagal theory. And I was lucky, I had a chance to connect with Steve Porges, and I asked him, like, I think this felt shift that Jen Lynn's talking about is a shift in autonomic state. And he said, yeah, absolutely. And so that's really how I thought, well, okay, I've got something here that can really be helpful as a framework. So you see the black heaviness of the dorsal, and with this wonderful sense, you know, we all know this place where we feel bad and something happens, you know, and then we start to feel better. We feel a physical release in the body. And often this comes when we're kept company by somebody who cares about us, who can hear what's happening. They don't have to offer solutions. You know, sometimes nothing changes about the problem itself, but we change in terms of how we feel about the problem because we've shifted states. So this is the first book, and this is the one that's just coming out now, 20 Embodied Practices, that basically takes you through the model, how to work with the model. I'm going to stop sharing and come back. And we always start really slowly and carefully. People ask me about this a lot. The basic tenet is around titration. That I believe that when we teach people as therapists or coaches, and also our clients, to learn how to titrate, how to manage this, you know, back and forth between flooding and numbing. When people learn how to do that, it's really the basis for living a good life, right? When we know we can settle ourselves inside, we can calm ourselves, we can find people in community like this and be able to do that. And so that's the crux of what we teach in the model. I also created an embodied assessment and treatment tool, of which there's a chapter in this wonderful book. If people don't know, this book just came out, Somatic Oriented Therapies. It's amazing. It's like a little, well, it's big, handbook of somatic therapies. I think there's like 33 chapters or something. And in there, I shared the assessment tool because, again, I was teaching grad students and they're asking me about assessment. And I'm thinking, well, I don't use the DSM. I never have. What do I do? What do I actually do? And so I wrote down and began to really ask myself and ask students and clients that were all working with me, what do we do here? And so I created an assessment tool that's basically about assessing neuroception in the client. Where are they in the nervous system? And where are they in their felt sense capacity? And so Jan Lynn created a scale for that, actually, but I'll stop there.
Well, okay. I mean, it's hard to follow up on all this information, and also learning about how flexible the model might be depending on where
Yeah.
people are coming from. So I want to get real practical and concrete. And I wonder if you could give us a case example and how it started and how you use this. If we were a fly on the wall or a camera on the wall, what would we be seeing you doing? And what kind of questions you'd be asking, what kind of exercise you'd be doing? Just one case example might help.
Yeah, sure. So I would first be connecting with this person as myself, an authentic person who is very aware of the profound importance of presence and the willingness to what Jan Winhall called share my shaky being, in the context of holding space, of course, but being a person with another person and working to find out what helps that person to feel safe. So that's the basis of everything, really. And then sharing with them that I do have some ideas about what could be helpful. There's a lot of psychoeducation in the model, teaching people slowly and carefully about how to come into the body. And we start there often with just, can you pause? And that's a big thing for a body that's in flight, fight all the time. So we're starting very slowly in that journey about embodiment. Don't rush it at all. But what I find is if people really feel held, they'll come with you. And so then we often talk about what happens to, what's going on in your life, where are the problems, and what happens in your body. Or I notice that, you're really tensed up there. And that gives a little avenue into teaching about the 7Fs, about how bodies work in terms of helping themselves through adaptive behaviors to be able to survive. And once we kind of got some awareness around that and people are on board with that, which can take time for sure, we also then start to introduce this sense of being able to pause and feel into focusing, to feel into where does all of that live in your body. So we always start with resourcing good stuff. We might not have time to do that practice. So maybe just to say, maybe we will, but to start with resourcing a time in your life where you felt okay. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just to find a little example of a time where you felt okay in your life. And then helping people to slow down with that a bit and to notice, where were you? And what was the story? So we slow down like this as people feel safe enough to be able to do that in their bodies. And then, what were the sounds you heard? What were the smells? Were you alone? Was somebody else there with you? You slow it down. And then you can ask somebody, well, where do you feel that in your body? This place where you feel okay. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. And people, once they're inside, they know where they feel it. So then you might say, can you put a hand there where you feel that place? And often it's in the center of the body. So you just encourage people to slow down a little bit more. And then you might say, step 5 in focusing, it's like, what's that all about in there? So you're going deeper down into what bodies know about this issue in your life, right? And so finding that place where there's a sense of a moment that feels okay, and then finding a place where there might be a sense of something that doesn't feel okay. And then over time, weeks, months, years, we work with both of those places in the body. The place that feels okay becomes a resource for the place that's really struggling. And we show people, and I work often in groups. I used to. Now I'm not doing much frontline stuff, but teaching in groups, teaching therapists in groups to do their own work, to feel into this. And this is what we'll do in the 2 days. So you feel into your own resources in your body, and you also feel into the places that are uncomfortable. And we use the place that feels like a resource to help with the place that's uncomfortable. And then we also created this 4-circle harm reduction practice, which is for working with really stuck places, bad habits and addictions. And we might then get on a journey of kind of exploring that, there's something that's going on here that you're using to help yourself that felt adaptive when you were really unsafe, but now it's causing you some harm, right? And we define addictions very simply, just to say something that helped you in the short term, it hurts you in the long term, and you can't stop doing it. It's that simple. And their addictions can be to anything. Often they're behavioral, as well as drugs and alcohol. So we work with that and we reframe it. We continue to keep reframing it with the person to heal the shame. So I'm here with you. We're moving through this process. You're learning about your nervous system and how you lived in that dorsal state for decades, shifting back up into flight fight to be able to survive. Because what's really interesting, Michael, is like people can't live forever in a dorsal or a sympathetic state. I talked about this very specifically with Steve. The body will instinctually shift. If you're in a dorsal state, will shift into seeking high risk behaviors to move into sympathetic if there's not enough safety for ventral. And if you're too stuck in sympathetic, the body will shift into behaviors that bring you into shutting down in order to rest, because you can imagine flight fight is very metabolically challenging in the body. It can't sustain it. So we teach people about this over time, how to befriend your body, to learn how it works through the nervous system, through felt sensing, and how you can find those shifts in the body into that physical release. And the 4-circle harm reduction plan is really a map that brings all of those things together. So the inner circle is the behaviors that you want to change. And we really quantify those in a harm reduction way, which includes sobriety, but not just sobriety. And we make those changes through working with the nervous system. When and how is the body going to feel safe enough to be able to shift from these adaptive behaviors of addiction and bad habits in an unsafe context into behaviors that are going to help you to feel better? So the second ring are the triggers. They're the autonomic states of sympathetic and dorsal. What activates those inner circle behaviors? The third ring are the ventral practices, living a good life, and all of the ways that you can develop a focusing partnership with another person, therapy, being with each other in family, being here together in leading edge community, all of these ways that we can really support each other's well-being. And the fourth circle are kind of the really deepened spiritual practices. So by the time we've filled that out together over time, the person has a map of how to live a good life. And with their focusing partnership, we call it a focusing accountability partnership, you sustain that by daily practices, which is really, it is what it takes. I mean, it's addictive neural pathways are hard to shift, especially if you've been at it for decades, which lots of clients have, especially when they have 3 or 4 different ways of shifting states, right? So you can see how important it is for trauma therapists to be addressing self-harm and addiction. Because if you follow along with the polyvagal lens, if you're struggling with trauma and your body's in that trauma feedback loop, you are going to be developing behaviors that are going to harm you because they're not grounded in a ventral place, and they usually become addictive because they work. So you travel down them and back and forth many, many, many times because they're keeping you alive. Yeah.
Well, uh, I would think there might be some questions and people would like to talk to you. But at first, when you were talking about how you talk to clients and you teach students in groups, I wonder if you could do a practice right now for all of us in our little group today that you think would be helpful for all of us right now before we go into questions.
Absolutely. We can do the felt sense polyvagal grounding. We've already started it a little bit. So absolutely. So yeah, find what feels right for you. If you would like to stay sitting, or some bodies really like to stand up when they focus. We actually have a whole group of people called whole body focusing people that stand up and move when they focus. So, and just to get a sense of, we're going to start with neuroception. Does it feel okay for you today in this moment to pause? Just checking to see if it's okay to pause and to begin by just noticing what's around the room. This is the second practice in my new book. So just noticing what's around the room and settling yourself, and then checking to see, is there something that you're drawn to that you could spend a bit of time just noticing it. And then just checking to see again, would it be all right just to soften your gaze and slowly begin to turn your attention somewhere down into the center of your body. And if that doesn't feel all right, that's really just fine. You could just stay and listen if that feels okay. And then just noticing, how are you carrying yourself today in your body? Often the way our muscles feel tells us a lot about neuroception, how safe we feel in our bodies. So if you find your muscles are kind of tight and constricted parts of your body, maybe you're feeling a little bit of fear or anxiety, maybe irritation or anger, just notice that. Or maybe your muscles feel pretty heavy today, heavy and thick, stuck maybe. And maybe there's some sort of sadness in there, or some kind of numbing and dissociating. Just notice that. Or it may be that your muscles are feeling quite fine. Your body's quite relaxed. Feels good in the moment. And just notice that. And it may also be that you're in a kind of blended state, which I think most of us probably live in a lot of the time. Bodies are alive, they move around a lot. So there's some fluidity to the nervous system. So you might be feeling kind of like I am right now. There's a kind of fun, fired up feeling. I feel lots of lovely, grounded ventral energy, and also a little bit more adrenaline, sympathetic than I normally would, because I'm on camera here, you guys. So just notice if there's a little bit of that kind of heightened tension, but with a nice solid grounding. Or you may find that there's a nice blending of ventral grounded energy and a beautiful sense of safety and flowing that comes from a safe place in the dorsal vagus. When the dorsal branch feels enough safety, it feels comfortable to be still, to relax into this wonderful, deeper place of relaxing and feeling the fullness. Or it may be that you're aware of this kind of trauma feedback loop that so many of us get stuck in these days. There's some anxiety and tension, maybe anger, and then it's kind of mixed in with shutting down. And that's a hard place to be. So one of the things that we can do to help that trauma feedback loop is to invite in interoception, felt sensing. We can say, we're all here together in this beautiful community in Toronto and in Canada. And we're all here together at leading edge. And this co-regulation, this moment that feels good enough, it can really help that struggling place of the trauma feedback loop. Just allowing our bodies to feel into we're not alone. And feel into the strength of the group. We can make a difference. And we can pass this beautiful felt sense on to our clients when we take good care of ourselves. So let's try step 3 in focusing on getting a handle for this place. A word or an image. Or maybe it's a sentence. Or a movement in your body. Something that captures the essence of this moment. That we can feel in together. Something that helps you to use this place as a resource when you feel dysregulated. Slowly and gently, we take our time to feel your feet on the ground. You might want to jot down your handle, or this is where we would use a body card. You might do that after this call. You can download them on my website. You can even choose what body card you'd like to have. We have different shapes and colors because bodies have different shapes and colors. They're all not white and skinny. And then slowly come back to our group. everybody back? Michael's not back.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. I wonder if, wow, I wonder if anyone would like to share with Jan their experience just now. We have a little bit of time for that, as well as any questions from anything. Emily, do you want to take it from here? Do we have anyone who would like to join in this community and share?
We don't have any in the chat yet. So someone said it was lovely and I didn't want to leave until it was done. Thank you. Looking forward to the book, but they do have to run. If anyone does have any questions or thoughts, you're welcome to put them in the chat or send them to me privately if you're shy. Otherwise, we'd love to hear your voice. Welcome to raise your virtual hand. Oh, here's one. Many clients struggle with self-blame when it comes to addiction. How can therapists help reframe those experiences through the lens of your Felt Sense Polyvagal Model?
Yeah, that's the paradigm shift. It's through understanding that addictive processes function in the nervous system as what we call state regulation strategies. It's teaching people that these are survival behaviors that anybody does when they're in life threat or perceived life threat, because we can get triggered and then be perceiving that we're threatened when we actually aren't, right? We know about triggers. So that is what we call these moments of liberation. And that's why I love doing this work in addiction, because it no longer becomes a power struggle where the therapist is trying to get the client to change. It's a very different way of working with addiction through understanding that basically they're instincts. And the body will go there instinctually because bodies are designed to survive. And so that knowing, and when you want to really start to believe that, and particularly working in groups, it just takes the shame away. It's like, oh my God, my body's just doing what it was supposed to do when I was under threat. And if anybody finds that hard to believe, imagine in that groups that I was doing with young women who were survivors of incest. Imagine what it would be like for them if their bodies hadn't dissociated. How would you survive? Dissociation is a gift. And even with self-harming behaviors where you would see young women who've been sexually abused that would go into environments that were unsafe sexually, there are reasons for that. Part of it has to do with if you're numbing so much and you're seeking to survive by shifting into sympathetic, the body seeks out these old neural pathways where you were hurt, because in that hurt state, the body released endogenous opioids, natural opioids in the body in order to numb, to survive. That's huge. When we understand that, we understand that bodies know how to heal wounds. They know how to heal scratches and burns, and they also know how to heal emotional wounds. We just haven't been listening. We've decided that bodies are sick or people are bad. And that's wrong. It's just not the way bodies work. And that's amazing. When you can give that to somebody, why wouldn't you want to do this work? Yeah.
Thank you. When we talk about addictions, is your workshop going to be more than drug and alcohol addiction?
Oh, yeah. We talk about addiction. We talk about anything that helps you in the short term. It hurts you in the long term, and you can't stop doing it. You might be able to, if you binge, you might be able to stop for periods, but you go back. And here's an example of that. And we help people not by telling them things, but by showing them. So we say, well, you can feel in your body when you're in sympathetic or dorsal, right? You can feel flight, fight, or folding down. They'll go, yeah, now I get it. Now I get it. Okay, so what do you do that helps you to shift those states? And people begin, because I know this, because I'll just say to people that don't know anything about the model, I'll say, well, when you're really tight, you come home from work and you're really anxious and wound up. If you drink a bottle of booze, what happens? Well, you may perk up a little bit and then you shut down into dorsal. And I go, oh yeah, I know that feeling completely. It's like, that's how addictions work, right? So we teach people how to be able to understand the behaviors that shift them. And here's one example that I actually put in this new book because I thought it was so important for people to realize so many things can be addictive behaviors. So one, for example, is counting patterns in a carpet. Counting patterns is a way of dissociating. It's trance-inducing. So anything that your client learned to do that induces a trance state or dissociated state, it becomes addictive because it works. And the more you travel, the more you learn about neuroplasticity, and I talked about this a fair amount in this book as well as the first one, the more you learn about neuroplasticity and how we travel down these same neural pathways over and over again, they become ruts. And then what happens is what we call this plastic paradox. So initially, the way that brains can keep changing and growing actually becomes a stuck state in an addictive brain. And those ruts, we need to work hard to shift those. But the good news is that we can through working with neuroception and interoception. And so, yeah, pretty well anything can become addictive if it's helping you to shift back and forth.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat just yet.
Well, Jan, then I'll ask you, before we started the session, you talked about how trauma therapists can integrate a better understanding in working with addictions. Because a lot of people used to think of it as different. I'm an addictions counselor. No, I'm a psychotherapist who deals with trauma. And you're saying something different. So how do you start the journey in your practice?
Well, yeah, what we're saying is that if you're working with trauma, you're working with addiction. Because if you're working with trauma from a polyvagal lens, you're working in that trauma feedback loop in the nervous system between sympathetic and dorsal, with the absence, a lot of the time, of ventral energy. And so if you're working in that feedback loop, what are your clients doing in order to shift back and forth? Because they can't stay in one of those states. So they will shift back and forth. In too much of a dorsal state, you can die. You can die in a severe dorsal state because our heartbeat lowers more and more and more. And so bodies will seek out stimulation. So you work with, well, what is it that you do that helps you with that? And it can be things, anything. It can be food, it can be exercise, it can be sex, all of those things, especially food and sex are very early on ones that develop where you're seeing clients that have profound sexual abuse histories. And so it's incumbent upon us as trauma therapists to ask about it. And I understand why people don't, because working with addiction, it's always been separate. It's just starting to come together now. But it's hard work. But it's a lot harder when you get into power struggles with people and you don't pay attention to why the body is struggling to shift because it doesn't feel safe enough. Bodies will shift with safety out of that trauma feedback loop.
I think we have an audience question.
Sorry?
Oh, I think we have an audience question from Judy. Hi, Judy.
I wanted to ask you, Jan, that was a wonderful kind of meditation that you led us through. And when you're talking about dissociation as a gift, and yet it also sounds like, from what you also said, that it can be a stuck state where those ruts are very, very deep. And when they go so deep that it's taken control of the system, how do you start to tease it out or to bring it alive when it's kind of rigid?
Yeah, well, it's rigid in freeze, and then in real dissociated collapse, it's limp. It's like this, whoa. And one of the best ways to do that is to encourage people, if they will, to go into group first of all, because group is like a little supercharger of co-regulation. But often people won't do that in the very beginning. And a lot of it has to do with working with the part that brought them to you. So there's this huge part that's dissociated, but there's some part in there. There's something there that brought them to you, or that wants to be alive. And so it's helping the person find that by being really sensitive to who they are and tuning in and not frightening them with too much eye contact, but there's something there that it seeks out health and growth and restoration in the ventral vagus because they're alive. And so it's a gentle, often if it's in a therapeutic relationship, it's really working with the part that brought them to you. If it's in a different kind of a friendship or something where you see your person, your friend dropping down, inviting them out, inviting them to be with you and not have to do anything, just to be with you, to give them the message that you want to be with them. They're important to you. And then slowly starting, if it's in therapy, by noticing times where they might look at you, or they might reach out to say something, and just saying something about that. It's like really nice to connect with you more. Feels really good. What's it like for you? Looking for these places, looking for where the body starts to move into contact. Social engagement is like eye contact. It's like looking at each other, smiling. Now, if you do that and somebody's really shut down, they're just going to get scared. But if you approach it like you would a little being that's afraid, how would you approach a little being that's afraid, or a big being that's afraid? Yeah. And meeting them where they are, right? Meeting them where they are.
And could you also say something about titration?
Well, this is titration, what we're just talking about now. And titrating on the other end. So in focusing in step 5, we can work with that a lot with titration. So we can say, is it okay to maybe take one little step up towards this really scary place? So you're teaching people how to work with that grounded place, like we did a little bit before, and then going into the discomfort. So you hold on to the felt sense of the grounded place, and you kind of visit the edge of the place that's really uncomfortable, which may be your shoulder or your stomach or your gut, right? Your belly or your vagina. Can be all those places where trauma lives. And we work with both of those places in the body. One says hello to the other. And we work in focusing partnerships. So you're not doing this alone. You can invite a person. Is it okay to stay here? Or do you need to step back a bit if they're in too much fight? If you feel, you can see them start to constrict and go up, you can say, is it all right to just step back a little bit with me? Or let's put this in a rowboat and row back from it. So many different ways that we can work with something that's really uncomfortable in there and in the body, and always resourcing ourselves in relationship and also the distance. Gendlin would say, you're too close. You've got your head in the soup. You've got to be at the edge of the pot, learning to be with what's uncomfortable. And at the same time, the paradigm shift for Gendlin was learning to welcome what's uncomfortable. Because what's uncomfortable gives us often the most information about how we're living our lives. And it's where the trauma lives. So we have to learn how to be with it. But we can do that together. Yeah. So many different ways of being able to titrate. And lots of different, like somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's work. Peter Levine was a student of Gendlin's, and he's done beautiful work with titration. Pendulation, I think he calls it. Yeah. Yeah. So this isn't about, this model is about take it and bring the body into everything we already know. And that it will only get better.
Well, maybe this is a good place to stop. We'll only get better. Besides for the clock telling us it's probably time to stop. First, I want to tell everyone out there that you'll get a message with a copy of this video, information about Jan's book, Caversham in Toronto. We'd be happy to send you a copy as soon as they get it in March. And Norton will do the same for American followers. Please consider joining Jan in Toronto for a couple of days in May. We will really dig into this. So Jan, thank you very, very much. I want to first thank Emily for being behind the scenes and doing all what you do. And Jan, thank you very much for being here today. I think it's been very informative and also moving. I'm still sitting with your practice and your exercise, and it feels good. So we do something kind of funny at the end of these sessions, which is a little wild. We say, if people want to say goodbye to you, you can open up your microphones and we'll end with a cacophony of whatever people have to say and wish everyone a good day. So thank you.